Okay then. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, today's session. So as I'm sure you're aware that today we are going to discuss about CPR and some cardiovascular emergencies. And be sure that CPR is quite CBS and CPR, these are quite commonly asked topics in your AMC MCQ examination. So please at least expect 15 to 10 questions out of the CVS, but it also depends on your luck. Sometimes you might get more questions, sometimes you might get less, but definitely there are quite a few important topics in CVS, and out of those, we are going to discuss these today. So in today's session, we are going to talk about CPR, as I just said, arrhythmias, and ischemic heart disease, which is MI or myocardial infarction. So let us begin. And throughout this session, if you have any questions for me, doctors, please you can type on the chat box or you can open your mic and ask me, and I'll be quite happy to sort any and all of your queries. So let's begin. So first of all, we are going to discuss CPR. So CPR, it comes again under either basic life support or advanced cardiac life support. It comes under both of these algorithms. But in today's class, we are going to be focusing on the ABCC part of the management. So when do we start a CPR? We all know if a person is unconscious and you encounter a situation outside, and then there is a protocol that we all need to follow. Yes, first of all, we check for the scene safety. This is when we're talking in regards of BLS, which is basic life support. I'm sure some of you might have completed your BLS training through the AHA or in your colleges. So we'll just go over the basics. So first of all, you're going to check the scene safety, because making sure that you are safe and the scene is safe is the first and foremost thing. So you do not put yourself in danger. The second thing you do is you check for the responsiveness from the person who's unconscious, whom you found, and then you check for a pulse if you find that the person is unresponsive. And after that, it is very, very important that you call for help, and only then that you begin the CPR, which is your uh, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So what you're going to start, first of all, you're going to start doing the compressions. So for compressions, we all know we put our hands one over the other, right over the left, and then we put it over the lower half of the sternum, and then we start the compressions. And the ratio is 30:2 when there's one person doing the CPR. So what does this mean? First, you're going to give 30 chest compressions, and then you're going to give 2 rescue breaths. For the rescue breath, you're going to give 2 breaths. So for this, you have to make sure that the breaths are adequate. You can either do mouth to mouth, you can use a handkerchief, you can put a mask over the person's face who's being resuscitated. And if you have some other equipments available, like a bag mask device, you can use that. And if somehow you have more than one person available, if there are 2 people, you can even do CPR at a ratio of 15:1, 15:2, which means after 15 compression, the person can give 2 breaths. You can go like that. And if the person is put on a ventilator or is already been intubated, then you usually do 6:1. Like after 6 compression, the machine will automatically give 1 breath. So that's how it goes. And for the effectiveness of the chest compressions, we have to make sure that they are at least 4 to 5 centimeters in depth. You could also say about 2.5 inches. And after that, you have to allow the complete recall of the chest wall. Because if you don't do that, there's not going to be a good venous return to the heart, and you won't be pumping out the blood adequately. So that also needs to be done. And the compression rate should at least be 100 to 120 per minute. So you can either count while you're doing this, that you're making sure that the compressions are effective. And you can, if the person is attached to monitors, then the monitors will let you know that the compressions are adequate enough and you're getting a heart rate of 100 to 120 per minute, the compression rate. So that is also very important. And if you are in a outside of an hospital setting, then you can also get a small device which you can put under your hand, and you can use that. It tells you if the compressions are effective, if you are doing them well enough and at an adequate rate or not. And also allow full recoil, as I just said. And we have to minimize interruptions while we're doing compressions. So the only time you're allowed to interrupt compressions is either when you're giving a breath or when you are defibrillating the patient. And now we are coming to defibrillation. So when the person is in cardiac arrest, so there are two types of rhythm that you can get. Ones are shockable rhythms, and the other ones are non-shockable rhythms. So under the shockable rhythm, you can get ventricular fibrillation or pulseless ventricular tachycardia. So we'll discuss these two terms in more details as we go ahead because they also come under the broad term of arrhythmia. So we'll discuss these as we go on. So first and foremost, we have started the compressions, and in the meanwhile, you have plugged in your defibrillator and it is charging. And as soon as your defibrillator has charged, you are going to deliver a shock. So either you could attach the pads that you have, or you can use the paddles which are available with the defibrillation machine. So as soon as your machine is charged, you deliver a shock after clearing the patient and asking everyone else to clear. And after that, after you're done delivering the shock, you immediately start with your CPR again. You do not wait for anything else. You do not check the pulse. You do not check anything else. You just start your compressions as soon as possible. And if you have a manual defibrillator, you can give up to 3 stacked shocks, which means one after the other. And between shocks, we have to at least do a CPR for 2 minutes. And by that, you also mean that you'll allow the machine, the defibrillator, to charge again. And in the meanwhile, you're going to continue your compressions, chest compressions, and your breath, giving the patient breaths. So the defibrillation energy, we're going to start with 200 joules, and we can repeat. And for particular arrhythmias, there's also a certain set of energy that you need to set. You don't need to remember that. Just remember that you need to give the shock as soon as possible in the shockable rhythms. So once you attach the defibrillator, it will also check what sort of wave you're getting on the ECG. So you can decipher based on that, either it's a shockable or non-shockable rhythm. So under non-shockable rhythm, there comes asystole and pulseless electrical activity. So in asystole, you most likely get a flat line. But if you're getting a flat line, then you have to make sure that all the leads are attached correctly and they are not like detached from the monitor. You also have to make sure that the lead, you can increase the amplitude of the waves, and you just have to make sure that all the leads are also attached to the chest and attached to the machine before you call a rhythm an asystole. And in pulseless electrical activity, there's electrical activity, but you're not getting any pulse in the patient. So that's pulseless electrical activity. And in these situations, we do not shock the patient, we do not defibrillate, we only give the patients CPR and give them drugs. And what drugs are we going to use? We're going to use adrenaline, and adrenaline we use either after every 3 to 5 minutes. Like you're doing your compressions, then after every 3 to 5 minutes, you're going to give a dose of adrenaline, 1 mg IV, and you're going to go like that. Continue your compressions, then give the dose. And amiodarone we are going to use if the patient is having ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. So in these conditions, in ventricular tachy and ventricular fibrillation, you're going to make a cycle sort of. You're doing compressions, then you're giving the shock, then you're doing compressions, then you're giving a dose of drug. Then once again, you're doing compressions. After 2 minutes, you're going to give a shock. Then once again, start the compressions, and again, you're going to give the drugs. So that's how you're going to go. And atropine can also be used if it's bradycardia or asystole. So bradycardias, once again, we'll discuss in a short while because they also come under the arrhythmia. And magnesium sulfate we use for Torsades de Pointes. Torsades de Pointes, guys, is a ventricular tachycardia. It's sort of a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, and it is quite a severe condition. So in that condition, we use magnesium sulfate. And bicarbonate we only use if there's severe hyperkalemia, TCA toxicity, because that causes acidosis. And bicarbonate is used to decrease the, to increase the pH, which has decreased the blood pH. Or if the person is having prolonged arrest, once again, that is going to cause respiratory acidosis. So to check or convert the acidosis to normal pH, we're going to use bicarbonate. So these are the conditions when you're going to use bicarbonate. And for bradycardia management, we are going to observe the patient if the patient is stable. And if the patient is unstable, we can give them atropine 0.5 mg every 3 to 5 minutes. The maximum dose is about 10 mg. And yeah, and if it's ineffective, we can do pacing. So pacing could be transcutaneous, or it could be permanent pacing or temporary pacing. So that depends on the situation. And these are the reversible causes of cardiac arrest. So it will be wise to remember this, because cardiac arrest or loss of consciousness can occur because of n number of situations and n number of reasons. So you have to rule out everything before you consider that the patient is under cardiac arrest. So these are the causes. These are some of the few causes which could be causing cardiac arrest in a patient. So it could either be hypoxia, hypovolemia, hypokalemia. So hypoxia, it's quite easy to find out. You'll attach the pulse oximeter and you'll get a low oxygen saturation. And hypovolemia, of course, you'll be shown when you're checking the BP that the patient is having hypertension. Blood pressure systolic would be less than 90. And hypo or hyperkalemia, you can either get ECG changes, and once you do the ABG, you can also get problems in that. And if you're doing a blood count, full blood investigation, you can get that as an electrolyte disturbance. And hypothermia is the dropping of body temperature. So below 32 degrees Celsius, we know it is quite often that the person gets a cardiac arrest, and we have to check for the hypothermia as well if the patient is having a cardiac arrest. And the four T's, tension pneumothorax, we know it's when there's a lot of air accumulation in the chest cavity. The lung has collapsed, and there's tension building up inside the chest cavities. That's tension pneumothorax, and it could be spontaneous or it could be traumatic. And cardiac tamponade is collection of blood around the heart. It can also cause the same. The toxins, either drugs or some other toxins, and thrombosis like MI or pulmonary embolism can also cause cardiac arrest. So this is all about CPR. But you have to know that we go in the hospital, you'll do the ABC protocol. And for that, you'll have a whole team. The whole team will be there, so you can do everything simultaneously. But when you're outside and you don't have any help, you're going to follow the BLS protocol, and that's how we'll go about it. So, the most important factor to achieve a successful resuscitation in a patient is early defibrillation, and identifying the rhythm is also very important. And you will do that once you get the defibrillator and attach the monitor to the patient. And we have to check the rhythm, and according to that we have to treat the patient if you're getting a cardiac arrest. And the most important thing is, if there is a reversible cause, we have to find that out and remove that. And after that, we have to give the patient post resuscitation care, because it is quite often, if the cause is treated, that the same thing can occur again. So taking care of the patient after you have resuscitated the patient successfully is also very, very important. Maintain the core body temperature and monitor the vitals as well. And if you're getting a pulseless, a non-shockable rhythm, then it is important to remember that you do not shock the patient, but rather give them drugs and continue with the CPR and try to find out whatever is causing it and remove that cause. So this is about CPR, and we'll move ahead. If you have any questions, guys, please ask, or you can type in the chat box. Otherwise, I'll be moving ahead with the next topic. Okay. So we are going to discuss arrhythmias. So we know arrhythmias is when we get an abnormality in our ECG, which is the tracing of the cardiac electrical activity on a piece of paper. So arrhythmias, there could be many reasons for that. It could be drug induced, like beta blockers, digoxin, antiarrhythmics. We use these drugs to stop the arrhythmias, but they themselves have an arrhythmogenic potential. So be mindful when using these drugs, antidepressants, antipsychotics. So what does these cause? They can cause prolongation of the QT interval. They can cause bradycardia even, and they can cause AV block. So we have to be mindful if these drugs are being used, or these are being given to you in your STEM, and this sort of question can come to you, especially in drug overdose like TCA overdose, antipsychotics overdose. These are seen quite often. And myocardial ischemia can also cause arrhythmias. So, yeah, remember that. And we have to do an ECG, check the troponins, and clinical history is also very, very important when such a case comes to you. And electrolyte disturbances, hypokalemia, hypocalcemia, all these things can also cause arrhythmias. And hypoxia, hypovolemia, and thyroid disease. We know that hypothyroidism can cause a tachycardia even, and can lead to atrial fibrillation, and hypothyroidism can cause bradycardias. So whenever you're having an abnormality and a patient is having a history of thyroid disease, so be mindful to get those investigations and check for any thyroid problems. And sepsis and septicemia can also cause similar problems, cause arrhythmia in the patient. So now let's discuss bradycardia. Bradycardia is when the heart rate drops less than 60 beats per minute from our normal rate. So bradycardia could be physiological. It could be because when you're sleeping, your heart rate naturally decreases. It could be in athletes. There's an increased vagal tone, and they have a naturally slower heart rate. And it could be because of medications as well, like beta blockers and digoxin. So if the patient is symptomatic, and by symptomatic we mean if the patient is having any sort of palpitation, dizziness, if they're having loss of consciousness or hypertension, we have to treat that. And for that, we can either use atropine, and that's the dose we already talked about. And if that is ineffective and the patient is still having symptoms, then we can do pacing. Either it could either be transcutaneous or transvenous. And if we find a reversible cause, then we have to stop that, whatever is causing it. And if the patient is taking any medications which are causing bradycardia, then we have to stop those offending medications as well. And now we'll discuss the AV blocks. So, guys, let me tell you a little bit about an ECG. So, whenever you come across an ECG in your exam, first of all, you'll have to check that what's the rate. So, for example, in this ECG, for calculating the rate, you'll see and try to find the two R waves, and you'll check the number of boxes between these two R waves. Yes. So, here it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Approximately 6 large boxes between these two R waves. So you're gonna divide these. You're gonna divide 300 with 6, and this gives you 50. I'm talking about this particular ECG. So here, this ECG shows a heart rate of 50 beats per minute, which means this is definitely a bradycardia. So now, once you're done checking the rate, you'll see the rhythm, like what sort of waves you're getting in this ECG. First, you're seeing here, you're getting a P wave, then you're getting a QRS complex, and then you're getting a T wave. So this seems like the rhythm of this ECG is normal. And now you'll have to check if there are any other abnormalities. So what other abnormalities could be? Like the first degree AV block. So in AV block, what happens that there's bradycardia which you're gonna get, and the cause of the bradycardia could be of various kinds. So in first degree AV block, you're getting an increase in PR interval. So how you're gonna check the PR interval? From the start of the P wave till the start of the R wave, that's going to be your PR interval. So from here to here, from the start of P wave to the R wave, you have this PR interval. So each of the small boxes in the ECG is 0.04 milliseconds. So the PR interval is usually more than 200 milliseconds, then we call it an AV block. So you can calculate here, even in this, how many small boxes are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Approximately 6 small boxes you're getting, which means you'll multiply 6 by 0.04, and you are getting 240 milliseconds. So definitely this is a first degree AV block because the PR interval is more than 200 milliseconds, and here it is 240 milliseconds. So you can do that. These are small techniques which you can use to check and find out whatever sort of abnormality you're getting in the ECG. First, calculate your rate by dividing the number of large boxes between two R waves with 300, and then you can check the PR interval because each small box is 0.04 millisecond, and it should not be more than 200 millisecond, the PR interval, otherwise it's said to be an first degree AV block. And these AV block could be benign, or it could be because of increased vagal tones, could be because of medications as well. And we don't need to give any treatment for that because until unless they are symptomatic, like the patient is having hypertension, syncope, loss of consciousness, and all that. So what here, the AV block, it's the problem with the AV node. We all know that the electrical current generated by the SA node is the main one in the heart. So the SA node is going to generate the main electrical current, and that should be the fastest electrical area in the heart. But then the current comes from SA node to the AV node, and from that it goes on to the ventricles, to the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibers. But sometimes there's a block. So here there's a block, and the conduction is not going on well from the SA node to the AV node to the ventricles. So that is why there is a prolongation, because we know that the P wave is because of contraction of the atria, and the QRS wave is because of contraction of the ventricles. So there is a delay in the conduction from the of the electrical activity from the atria to the ventricles, and that's why you're getting this delay, which is the first degree AV block. Now let's discuss the second degree AV block, which has two parts. One is Mobitz 1 type block and the second is Mobitz type 2 block. In the Mobitz type 1 block, you're getting a progressive increase in PR interval. Like the first PR would be a bit wider, then the second would be more wider, and the third would be so wide, and the next one would be missed. And it's going to happen the same way. It's going to be sort of like a cycle. And here, once again, the block is at AV node, and we don't do anything unless the patient is symptomatic. The same one which was for the first degree AV block. Now the type 2, in this, the PR interval is constant. In type 1 block, the PR interval was increasing, but in type 2, the PR interval is constant. But suddenly there's going to be a non-conduction of the P wave to the atrial electrical activity to the ventricles. So the P wave is going to be there, and suddenly a QRS complex is going to be missed. And here the block is below the AV node, and it may even proceed to a complete block, which means that no QRS waves are going to be there. There's going to be no contraction of the ventricles. So this could be quite dangerous. And it is quite commonly seen after an myocardial infarction. And we need to do a insert a permanent pacemaker in these patients, because it can at any time proceed to a complete block and patient could go into cardiac arrest. So it is very, very important that you find out what sort of block it is and treat it for the patient. And if the patient is unstable, we can do temporary pacing for the time being, and then we can move on to doing a permanent pacing. So here, these are certain images. You can see how these are. In the first image, you can see that the PR interval is quite long and no QRS complexes are missed, and the PR is not prolonging as the time goes on. So this is definitely the first degree AV block. In the second image, you can see that the PR interval is prolonging continuously. It's increasing, it's increasing, and it's increasing. And after three times, the QRS complex is missed. So this is the Mobitz type 1 second degree AV block. Now this Mobitz type 2 second degree AV block, you're getting a prolonged PR interval, but it is constant, and suddenly a QRS complex is dropped or missed. So this is how you can differentiate between Mobitz 1 and Mobitz 2. Now, this is a second degree AV block, which is 2:1 block. So here you're going to get two P waves and then one QRS is going to be missed. So the blocks could be like that. It could be 2:1, 3:1, 4:1. So which means you can either get two P waves, then one QRS missed, three P waves, then one QRS missed, like that. And in third degree AV block, there's not going to be any association with the P waves and the QRS complexes. So there's total dissociation. And once again, it can lead to quite an unstable condition, and permanent pacemaker should be inserted in these patients because they can go into cardiac arrest at any time. So the heart rate could be 25 to 50 beats per minute in the third degree or complete AV block. And other than that, you can get Canon A waves in the JVP, can even get a systolic murmur. And in atrioventricular dissociation, it could be quite confusing between complete heart block and atrioventricular dissociation. But in atrioventricular dissociation, the QRS complexes are going to be more rather than the P waves are going to be more, which was in complete heart block. So the ventricles are contracting faster, so there are more QRS complexes, and it could be because of ventricular tachycardia or ectopic pacemaker, which means any tissue of the heart is beating so fast and generating its own electrical activity that it's overtaking the main pacemakers of the heart. So that's what's happening here. And in the ECG, you could get independent P waves and QRS complexes, but QRS complexes are going to be more. This is not that important of a topic and you don't get this, but definitely make sure to study the blocks quite thoroughly. They're quite often asked. You can even get an ECG. So please also make sure to look at a few ECGs for heart block. So in these heart blocks as well, always try to find out if there's any reversible cause, if it's because of thyroid, if it's because of beta blockers or anything like that. And we need to remove the cause if such a thing is going on. Even electrolyte disturbances can cause this. And if it's a Mobitz type 2 heart block or if it's a complete heart block, then we may need to do permanent pacing as soon as possible. And atropine is only given for symptomatic bradycardia. So that covers our bradycardias. Now we'll talk about tachycardia. So tachycardia is when the heart rate is more than 100 beats per minute. And in tachycardia, you could either have ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, and even paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia could be included in that. But first, we're discussing broad complex tachycardias. So, what do you mean by broad complexes? Broad complexes mean when the QRS complexes are wide and are more than 120 milliseconds. So, once again, you can calculate how much is the QRS complex by calculating the number of small boxes which are included under the QRS complexes and multiplying it with 0.04 yeah, and that will give you the number of milliseconds that the QRS complexes. And if it's more than 120, then it's a wide QRS complexes. And if it's wide, it could either be ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. But always be mindful that if the patient is stable, then it's more likely going to be a ventricular tachycardia, because in ventricular fibrillation, there is no chance that the patient is going to be stable. The patient will always be unstable in ventricular fibrillation. Because you know what fibrillation means? Fibrillation is like the heart is just fluttering. There is a lot of electrical activity going on, but none of it is actually making the heart contract. So there's just fluttering of the heart and no actual contraction. No blood is going anywhere, and the patient is going to be very, very unstable. And you need to immediately take measures to make sure the patient is fine. So ventricular tachycardia, the patient could be stable and they could be unstable as well. And if the patient are unstable and you're not finding any pulses in ventricular tachycardia, then you need to do immediate synchronized DC cardioversion, which means you need to shock the patient. And the current energy is going to be about 120 to 150 joules. And you can repeat it up to 3 times, like 3 cycles of shocks you can give. And other than that, you can use adrenaline and amiodarone as well. So amiodarone or lignocaine are the drugs which are used for ventricular tachycardia. And if the patient is stable, you can only use the drugs like amiodarone and lidocaine as well. So ventricular tachycardia, the patient could be stable or they could be unstable. And if the patient is stable, give only drugs. And if the patient is unstable, then you're going to shock the patient and use the drug simultaneously. So that's how you're going to treat a patient with ventricular tachycardia. Now, look at these images here. You can see that in the first image, the waves, the QRS complexes are more or like of a similar morphology. So this one here is a monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. And in the second image, the pink one, you can see the amplitude of the QRS complexes is sometimes increasing, sometimes decreasing. So this is more like a polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. So I'm sure you'll be able to recognize a ventricular tachycardia by checking the width of the QRS complexes and looking at the morphology of the QRS complexes, that either it's a monomorphic or polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. Either way, finding out a monomorphic or polymorphic ventricular tachy is not going to change your management of the case. You just have to find out if the patient is stable or unstable. What do you mean by an unstable patient? Either they're going to be no pulse, or the patient is going to be unconscious, there's going to be hypotension, there's going to be low oxygen saturation, and the patient could be in shock even. So then you need to immediately constitute a call for the emergency and crash cart and start your charging a defibrillator, start the CPR, and do everything possible to make the patient stable again. So if you're getting a broad complex tachycardia, always assume that it's a ventricular tachycardia unless you have an ECG strip and think it's something else. And if there is pulselessness, then we are definitely going to shock the patient out of it. And now let's go on and discuss ventricular fibrillation. So as you can see, when we were checking the ECG for ventricular tachycardia, the waves are more or less forming the QRS waves, the QRS complexes. But here it's just electrical activity everywhere. It's not forming a proper wave. It's just electrical activity everywhere. And be assured that there's not any meaningful contraction going on, and the patient is definitely going to be unstable. So you're not getting any complexes, any waves, just chaotic electrical activity. And we need to do constitute immediate CPR, call the crash cart, call for help, give the patient adrenaline, and shock the patient as soon as your defibrillator charges. And you can also use the drugs like amiodarone and lignocaine in this as well. Now, Wolff-Parkinson-White, it is a sort of a circuit forms because of abnormal uh, fibers, and there's a circuit formed which cause a cycle of electrical current going on, which causes abnormal activation of the heart fibers, which leads to this arrhythmia. So there's going to be a short PR interval, and after that, we're going to get a delta wave because of the abnormal circuit going on, and a wide QRS complex as well. This is not quite often asked in the examination, but I've just put it here for the sake of completion. And for that, for the management of this one, we are going to do a radio frequency ablation. We are going to cut down the abnormal circuit which has formed. And if the patient is stable, we can use procainamide, which is a class 1A antiarrhythmic agent. And if the patient is unstable, whenever the patient is unstable and you're having a cardiac arrest, then we shock the patient out of it. So, how does shocking a patient revert the heart into a normal rhythm? So what does it causes? It causes a temporary stoppage of the abnormal electrical activity which is going on. And after the heart restarts, we hope that it's gonna start at the normal electrical rhythm that it should be in, rather than taking the abnormal rhythm which was going on. So that's how we hope that the electrical activity is going to be reverted back to normal. And in the case of Wolff Parkinson White, make sure to avoid these drugs because they can worsen the condition. Now we'll discuss narrow complex tachycardia, which is paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia. Once again, you can check if it's narrow complexes by counting the number of small boxes between the QRS complex and multiplied by 0.04, you're going to get it should be less than 120 milliseconds. And that's here you're getting a narrow complex tachycardia. So PSVT could be of three types because of three causes. It could be AV node reentrant tachycardia. Once again, an abnormal circuit is formed and the electrical activity is circulating between that, causing abnormal excitation of the heart musculature. And it could be AV reentrant tachycardia as well. Like the AV node is because of the Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, and atrial tachycardia because of abnormal ectopic foci of electrical activity in the atria. So in paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, you're getting a rate of about 150 to 250 beats per minute. You can calculate the rate here as well. It's just a one small box between the two R waves. And if you divide it, so it's about 300 beats per minute in this ECG that you have here. So it's quite fast. Now the rhythm is going to be regular. You're not getting an abnormal or irregular rhythm. And P waves could be absent or they could be retrograde, which means you'll be getting the P waves after the QRS complexes. And the QRS are going to be narrow and the offs and offs could be sudden. So that's why this is called paroxysmal, because it can come on and off at any time and on its own. So if you're getting a narrow QRS, consider it a paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia. The patient could come to you with these sort of complaints that I'm having lightheadedness, I get these palpitations and they come on and off out of nowhere. And that sort of complaint or that sort of stem you can get. So if it's a narrow complex tachycardia, suspect PSVT. So these are the symptoms that the patient could get. And there's no chest pain usually because it's a very likely benign condition, terminates on its own. And the diagnosis, we are of course going to make a diagnosis by using an ECG, and we can do and Holter monitoring as well. Now for the management, if the patient is stable, we can do vagal maneuvers. So the vagal maneuvers are only for stable patient and we do modified Valsalva. So what is modified Valsalva? You take a 20 ml syringe and remove the needle from it and then ask the patient to blow on the syringe tip as hard as they can. And that's your modified Valsalva. And you can do carotid sinus massage as well if there is no bruise. And the drug which you're going to use is IV adenosine, first 6 mg, then 12 mg, then you can even use 18 mg as well. And verapamil diltiazem could also be used. And adenosine is the first drug that you're going to use. It's the drug of choice. And we're going to avoid verapamil or diltiazem if there is any Wolff Parkinson White or white QRS, because it could precipitate a ventricular fibrillation in the patient. And if the patient is unstable, once again, the only management for unstable patient is doing a cardioversion or shocking the patient out of it. Now, if the patient is having chronic PSVT, which means they are having these episodes for a long time and they come on and off, then we're going to constitute preventative treatment. And that's going to be either beta blockers or calcium channel blockers, which is going to control the abnormal rate of the heart. And we can even do catheter ablation, like cutting out the abnormal circuit that's going on and doing some lifestyle modifications as well. So the mainstay of treatment for paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, if the patient is unstable, then we're going to do the cardioversion. And if the patient is stable, we can use Valsalva maneuver and give drugs like adenosine and calcium channel blockers like verapamil and diltiazem. And finding out it on the ECG is also very, very important. So make sure to check for a narrow complex tachycardia with a heart rate of 150 to 250 beats per minute. Now, atrial fibrillation. It is because of abnormal electrical activity, very fast beating of atria, unable to conduct properly to the ventricles. So once again, a lot of electrical activity everywhere in the heart, but no actual meaningful contractions are going on. So the rhythm is irregularly irregular. All fibrillations are irregularly irregular. Same goes for ventricular fibrillation. And in this, there's going to be absent P waves, and because there's no actual contraction going on, so the P waves are absent, and that is also not being conducted to the ventricles. So the ventricles can be beating at their own rate. Some of the impulses generated from the atria could be conducted, so you can get QRS like that. So it is a irregularly irregular rhythm, and the atrial rate could be about 350 to 550 beats per minute. So the common causes you could for atrial fibrillation could be thyroid, it could be ischemic heart disease, which is myocardial infarction, can lead to that, even rheumatic heart disease. And there's an increased risk of stroke here as well. So in atrial fibrillation, make sure to check for any anticoagulation that has been instituted for the patient or not. Now, take a look at this ECG for atrial fibrillation. And first of all, the most important wave to look at is the second lead. And here you can see the fine fibrillatory wave, which are the hallmark of atrial fibrillation. And you can see the rhythm is very irregular, and it is irregularly irregular. You're not getting P waves, and there's just QRS complexes placed irregularly, and a lot of fine fibrillatory waves as well in the second lead. Other than that, you can also check the lead V1, and here again, once again, you're getting the fine fibrillatory waves, some QRS complexes, some are not present. So it's like that. And other than that, you can also take a look at AVF and lead one also. So you won't get any distinct P waves, irregular rhythm, and fine fibrillatory wave. This is the hallmark of atrial fibrillation. So for the management, you can either do rate control or rhythm control, but that depends if the patient is stable or unstable. If the patient is unstable, we are going to shock the patient out of it. Once again, DC cardioversion. And if the patient is stable, then we have two choices. We can either do rate control or we can do rhythm control. So if it's an acute case, less than 48 hours since the start of atrial fibrillation, you can do rate control, you can use digoxin, but avoid if there's hypertension going on. You can either use beta blockers for rate control, and also verapamil and diltiazem could be used. And rhythm control you're going to do if it is a young patient and the onset is less than 6 months ago, and if the patient is having symptoms. So rhythm control, you have to fulfill three criteria. If the patient is young, they're having symptoms and the onset is recent, and we can do electrical cardioversion or chemical cardioversion using these drugs. And once again, anticoagulation is very, very important for atrial fibrillation, because the heart is not contracting properly, and there could be collection of blood inside. So it's going to give out emboli, and these emboli can go and block any of the major vessels or small vessels and cause damage, either like a stroke, it can cause TVT, and anything like that. So anticoagulation is very, very important cases of atrial fibrillation. And if the atrial fibrillation is chronic, more than 48 hours, we are going to do rate control using beta blocker or digoxin. Once again, make sure there's no hypertension or heart failure. If there's heart failure, then make sure to use digoxin. And anticoagulation, we can use low molecular weight heparin or unfractioned heparin. Low molecular weight heparin is always a safer option to choose, because unfractioned heparin, you have to check for a lot of things. You have to do investigations, you have to check if the patient is having any reaction. So low molecular weight heparin is always safer to use. And cardioversion we do only after we include any thrombus using a transesophageal echocardiogram. So only then you're going to do a cardioversion, because it's chronic and there could be blood stagnant, and it could lead to emboli going out into the circulation. So these are types of atrial fibrillation. It could be paroxysmal, which means it will terminate on its own. It could be persistent, which means it's going on for more than 7 days, and it could be permanent, which means it's not going to be reverted. So if it's like that, you're going to get these kind of cases most likely in which there's an elderly patient who's having atrial fibrillation for a long time, and you've suddenly found out after doing an ECG. So rate control, which means using beta blockers, and anticoagulation by using the CHADS VSC2 score, is very, very important in these cases. And other than that, you can do AV node ablation and permanent pacemaker for these patients if there's any left ventricular dysfunction. But the only thing you need to remember in these cases is rate control and anticoagulation. Now, let's take a look at atrial flutter. It's also an abnormal rhythm of the generated from the atrias. So here, the patient is usually asymptomatic, but can also have some of symptoms like palpitations, fatigue, and shortness of breath. And it is often a complication of hypertensive heart disease. Atrial rate is going to be around 300 beats per minute, and the ventricular rate is going to be around 150 beats per minute, which means there's going to be a block, which could be 2:1. So the ECG that I've put here is from a block of 2:1. You can see that there are two P waves, and then once you're getting a QRS complex, and it could be 3:1, and you could even get a 4:1 block in atrial flutter. So atrial flutter, the hallmark is sawtooth-like waves, and these are specially present in lead 2, lead 3, and AVF. You can see here how these round small waves are going on. These are sawtooth waves, which are hallmark of atrial flutter. So atrial fibrillation, you're getting fine fibrillatory waves, and here you're getting more rounded sawtooth-like flutter waves. And the rhythm could be regular or irregular. If it's a fixed block, like this one here is, the block is 2:1, then you're getting an approximately regularly irregular rhythm. But if there's no fixed block, then you could get a completely irregularly irregular rhythm. Now, you can the differential diagnosis could be atrial fibrillation for this one as well. And here, once again, we are going to do rate control using beta blockers and calcium channel blockers like Brapamel and Diltiazem. We can do rhythm control, same criteria, younger patients, symptomatic, and less than 6 months. And we can use we can use drugs like amiodarone and sotalol. And electrical cardioversion if the patient is unstable. In any scenario when the patient is unstable, we are going to go for cardioversion, shock the patient out of it. And if it's chronic or persistent, we can do radiofrequency ablation, once again cutting out the abnormal electrical circuit which is going on. And anticoagulation, we are going to use the CHA2 DS2 VASC score, same score which we use for atrial fibrillation. Now, myocardial ischemia or acute coronary syndrome, once again, a very, very important topic, and quite often questions are asked on it. So, for this scenario, the patient is going to present with a very severe central chest pain. The pain could radiate to the shoulder, to the jaw, to the back, and this could be called as angina as well. But how are you going to differentiate amongst angina and myocardial ischemia? Here is the table which will help you. So if the troponins are elevated, then definitely it could be an MI. And if they're not elevated, then consider it an angina. Now we are going to do an ECG for the patient as well. And if there's ST elevation, then that is an ST elevation myocardial infarction. And if there's an ST depression and T wave inversion, then it is non-ST elevation MI. But the condition is that troponin should be elevated. And if you're getting no troponin elevation and no ST elevation, rather ST depression, then consider it an unstable angina. So these are the features. These are three things which you need to do once you get a patient with heart pain. Check for the ECG changes and then check for troponins. And that will help you find out if it's an STMI, an STMI, or unstable angina. So these are the symptoms that you're going to get. Pain, which is radiating to the left arm, to either jaw, the back, and could be heavy, tight, crushing. The patient is going to be sweating. There's going to be palpitations. And if the duration of pain is more than 20 minutes, then consider infarction to be quite likely. And these are associated symptoms like nausea, dizziness. So for making a criteria or diagnosis of myocardial infarction, you should have these three things that I already discussed. Uh, the ECG changes, ST elevation, you should have chest pain, and increase in cardiac markers, which is the troponins. So troponins are basically the chemicals which are released because of insult to the myocardium. So you can remember the troponins start rising between 3 to 12 hours and they peak within 24 hours. But that's just for your knowledge. These sort of questions are not asked. And in ECG changes, you can get ST elevation MI, which is STMI, and ST depression and inversion in NSTMI. And also in unstable angina, you can get ST depression and T wave inversion. So Q waves you're getting when the myocardial infarction is transmural, which means that all the layers of the heart, endocardium and myocardium and ectocardium, every layer is being affected. So you can affected, then you can get Q wave as well in the ECG. So the management for myocardial infarction, you can remember this as MONA-B, and I'm sure you know this mnemonic. It is very, very famous. So first and foremost, since the patient is in a lot of pain, You're going to give the patient painkiller, which is morphine. You can give it IV, and that is the drug that you're going to use. And then we are going to give patient some oxygen, and you're only going to give it if it's less than 94%. But just to make the patient, okay, we do give the oxygen if there's less than 94% oxygen saturation. Then we can give nitrates to the patient for the pain as well, and could be used sublingual or IV. So nitrates you're going to avoid if there's a severe hypotension, or if there's ventricular dysfunction, or if the patient has taken any drugs like sildenafil within the last 24 hours. And then you're going to ask the patient to chew on some aspirin. You can give them 300 mg stat aspirin to chew. And other than that, beta blocker you can give if there's no contraindication. Asthma is one of the contraindication of using beta blockers, so be sure to read this time very carefully. And other than that, you can use these drugs like clopidogrel, ticagrelor, and these are only these are used with aspirin as well. So you can use aspirin and clopidogrel together. And these come under later on. You can use this later on in the management. But first of all, you need to give morphine, oxygen, nitrates, and aspirin. These are the first and foremost things that you need to institute in a patient with MI. So other than that, you can give statin, you can give ACE inhibitors. So ACE inhibitors are good. They decrease mortality and are good for long-term management in myocardial infarction. And you can give anticoagulant as well, like enoxaparin or unfractionaparin. That depends on the management and the specialist treatment that's going on. So these are the ACG changes according to the time that has gone on after the insult to the myocardium, that is blocked in a blockage in a vessel. And the most important thing to do in a patient with an STMI is to do reperfusion. So 60 to 90 minutes, 90 minutes is the golden period. So if the patient presents to you within 90 minutes of the onset of pain, then you're going to send the patient for percutaneous intervention. So first of all, give the Mona and then send the patient as soon as possible to for percutaneous intervention. And if you have that PCI center at your hospital, then well and good. And if not, then transfer the patient with an ambulance. And you can do fibrinolysis if it is impossible to transfer the patient within 90 minutes to a PCI center. Within 12 hours of symptom onset, you can use fibrinolysis. And always use tenecteplase, alteplase, and streptokinase is not used, especially in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and prior exposure, because it can lead to a reaction in the patient. So it is not used in these conditions. So tenecteplase or alteplase are the drugs to go. Now, if it is an STEMI, then we monitor the patient and check for any risks, like how and what sort of changes you're getting in the ECG. And then we can do coronary angiography or PCI, percutaneous intervention, based on the risk that the patient is having. Now, after MI, you can do aspirin clopidogrel. That should be given for at least 12 months. This is called as dual antiplatelet treatment, which is given to the patient. And you can give beta blockers within 12 hours if there are no contraindications. And ACE inhibitors, you start within 24 to 48 hours. Also, statins, you can do low dose statin or high dose statin based on the risk that the patient is having. And anticoagulants if the patient is having atrial fibrillation or a mural thrombus. Now, long-term management. So remember, for these cases, you can also remember SNAP, which means no smoking, decrease alcohol, less than 10 standard drinks per week, then nutrition and physical activity. So we have to control the blood pressure as well and control the cholesterol, which means the blood lipids, and the SNAP, check for any depression or anxiety, and continue the long-term medication. These are some complications of myocardial infarction, like left ventricular dysfunction. You can get pulmonary edema. So if it's pulmonary edema, then you're going to give the institute the treatment which we call as L-MONA. L stands for Lasix. So you're going to give a diuretic, then do the MONA. You can get cardiogenic shock, so treat it like shock. You can get pericarditis. You can get Dressler syndrome. It is pericarditis because of MI. It is a complication. It arises within 2 to 4 weeks of MI. You can get arrhythmias. If you're getting an arrhythmia, then we're going to do the ACLS protocol, and left ventricular aneurysm or thrombus or papillary muscle rupture, which asks for or warrants for a surgical management. So remember that and go through this, read this. It could be like given to you an ECG and the leads in which you are getting the ST elevation and T wave inversion. In these leads, you are going to check which part of the myocardium is affected. You could be asked these sort of questions. So please make sure to go through this as well. Now, the CHA2, DES2, VASC score, it is the stroke risk in atrial fibrillation, and it also helps us in finding out if we need to or need not to institute anticoagulation in the patient. So you're going to give dual antiplatelet treatment to the patient no matter what, but CHA2, DSC2, VASC score will help you in finding out if you need to give the patient anticoagulation as well, okay? So this is the score. You could be given the score in the examination and you could be asked if you need to constitute anticoagulation to the patient or not. So female sex is only counted as one because it's one of the factors here. Sex, if female, then you're going to take one as a point. Only if some other risk factor is also present. And otherwise, you're not going to count it. Okay. So if the score is more than 2 in males and more than 3 in females, that you're going to start directly acting oral anticoagulants like apixaban and rivaroxaban, and they're preferred over warfarin. So why they preferred over warfarin? Because they are more these are a bit costlier, but they're better to use because you don't need to monitor INR that frequently, and there's also less restrictions on diet and lifestyle. So these are preferred. But warfarin is used if there's mechanical heart valve always. And if there's any valvular heart disease, then warfarin is used in patient for anticoagulation and atrial fibrillation. Now, angina is basically chest pain. It could be because of myocardial ischemia and there could be no infarction as well. So angina could be stable, it could be unstable. So in stable angina, there's pain only when the patient is doing activity and it's going to last less than 10 minutes and it improves with rest and you can give nitrates to the patient. And there could be certain triggers for it, and these are the differentials which could be present for angina. There could be gastroesophageal reflux disease, it could be a panic attack as well. And anemia is also one of the causes which can cause angina because of poor blood oxygen supply. Now, it could be stable or unstable. Unstable angina comes on and off at any time, and it may even lead to an MI. But remember, there's not going to be any ST elevation and troponin elevation in unstable angina. And variant angina is because of coronary vasospasm, and you do get ST elevation in this one. So diagnosis, we can do ECG, we can do stress, and we can do echo as well, and CT or coronary angiography is the gold standard for this one. So the management for acute attack is nitrates. You can give sublingual nitrates, you can give spray to the patient, and aspirin, we are going to give per oral, and we avoid nitrates in those three conditions. The patient is hypotensive, if there's severe bradycardia, if there's any ventricular dysfunction, if the patient has taken sildenafil or vardenafil in the last 24 hours. So remember this. And for prevention, we can give aspirin, beta blockers, and nitrates, also calcium channel blockers. So we could do revascularization as well if there's severe symptoms, and but remember, it's not going to reduce mortality in stable angina, and coronary artery bypass grafting could also be done in multivascular disease, and left ventricular dysfunction and lifestyle management should be done. Now, this is the ECG. We have already discussed all about this, so just a preview. We already discussed about bradycardia, tachycardia, flutter, PSVT. So these are quite important things, and these are quite often asked, especially AV blocks, atrial fibrillation management, and anticoagulation and MI. So please do remember to go through these topics quite well. And yeah, electrolyte disturbances. So hyperkalemia and hypokalemia could be given to you. You could be given an ECG and you could be asked like what sort of treatment you're going to be constituting to the patient. So the normal value for potassium in our blood should be 3.5 to 5.5. If it is lesser than that, then you're suspecting either hypokalemia. If it's more than that, then it's going to be hyperkalemia. So hyperkalemia is going to give you tall peaked T waves, and there's going to be absence of P waves, and there's going to be a wide QRS. So the degree of changes in the ECG is going to depend on the degree of electrolyte disturbances. So if there's only a small elevation, then you're not going to get wide QRS complexes, and PRS and P waves are not going to disappear. And the same is for hyperkalemia. You can get flat T waves and prolonged QT. You can even get Torsades de Pointes, which is a ventricular tachycardia. So here, this is the ECG of hyperkalemia. You can see that there are tall T waves, and the P waves you can see here, these are not disappearing, which means that this is not a very severe case of hyperkalemia. Now, this ECG, this is an ECG for hypokalemia. And you can see that the severity of changes is not quite severe. So this must not be a very, very severe case of hypokalemia. So for management and hypokalemia, we usually we can give the patient potassium chloride depending on the severity of the changes. And if the severe and if it's hypokalemia, then we give patient calcium gluconate. Once again, depending on the severity of electrolyte disturbances and the imbalances, we can even give bicarbonate to the patient. Insulin and salbutamol are also given to the patient because uh, it causes it puts back potassium into the cells in the intracellular space rather than in the extracellular space, which is causing this hyperkalemia. Now let's discuss a few recalls. So please type your answers in the chat box. So this is the first question. This is a recall from 2025. Please go through this and type your answers in the chat box. So this is a case of MI, and the patient is taking many drugs. He also has a history of hypertension. He's taking aspirin, ticagrelor. This is an antiplatelet drug, metoprolol and lisinopril. And he was also on statin, but he stopped that due to muscle aches. So this is a common problem which patients have, and this is called statin-induced myopathy. And the patient can have muscle pains in large group of proximal muscles. So what do you think is the most appropriate next step we need to do for this patient's lipid management? Can you please type your answers in the chat box for this one? Yes. Yes, that's right. We are going to offer a moderate intensity statin therapy to the patient. See, advising fish oil supplements is not the thing to do here. They are definitely good for you, but they're not going to help us here because the patient already is using an drug-eluting stent and he has a history of MI and he has a family history of MI as well. So, not keeping the patient a statin is going to increase the risk of further myocardial infarction. And fenofibrate is not given here because they're only used for severe hypertriglyceridemia, which is triglycerides more than 5 millimoles per liter, and not for this scenario for LDL lowering. And so we're going to offer moderate intensity statin therapy. So what does this mean, moderate intensity statin therapy? This means three things. We can either give the patient a statin which has a low potency. Rosuvastatin is a high potency statin, so we can give a patient a low potency statin like pravastatin or pulvastatin. And other than that, we can give the patient an alternative therapy, like ask the patient to take statin at least 3 days a week and not every day. And other than that, we can also try a lower dose of statins for the patient. So these are the three things that you can do for the patient. And here the correct answer is moderate intensity statin therapy. So we do not need to do high intensity statin with CoQ10 because it is not done here. And we can first and foremost try the moderate intensity statin therapy. And PCSK9 inhibitors is also used for very high risk patients and who have severe statin intolerance and are not responding to moderate intensity statin therapy also. So C is the answer here. Now the next one, please type your answers in the chat box. There's an elderly male, he's having diabetes and hypertension, and he's having shortness of breath, basal crepitations, and he's having left ventricular failure as well. He's having raised sodium, and his potassium is, what do you think his potassium is? Is increased or decreased? And he's having mildly low chloride. So, what do you think is the management for this patient? So, he's having shortness of breath, he's having basal crepitations, and he's having left ventricular failure. What do you think this patient is suffering from? Okay, so what does this picture show you? What is this patient having? Why is he having basal crepitations and shortness of breath? Yeah, you're right, guys. This is definitely, yeah. That he's having heart failure. And for heart failure, there's fluid overload going on. And that is why he's having shortness of breath and basal crepitations. So we know in a left ventricular heart failure, it causes pulmonary congestion, and if it was right ventricular heart failure, it was gonna cause systemic congestion more like. So because of left ventricular heart failure going on, he's having pulmonary congestion. So the treatment we are gonna constitute for this one would be L-MONA. So Lasix is the first thing we need to do, which is IV furosemide. So that's what we are gonna give the patient. So spironolactone is also a diuretic, but we are not using it because the patient is already having a high potassium which is more than 5.5, so this is of no use here, and furosemide is the first diuretic that we are going to give to this patient. And steroids is also not to be given here because it has no use in a heart failure patient. And inhaled salbutamol, it could have been given if it was like isolated hyperkalemia, which was causing some changes in the patient's ECG, but that is not the case here. And IV fluids, it's just gonna worsen the condition that this patient is already having. So no need to give them any IV fluids as well. So very good, guys. Very good. Let's go on to the next one. So this is from 2023. This patient is post MI and he had a percutaneous intervention already done for him. And he's in cardiac care unit, which is the CCU. And he's having a third degree heart block now. But he is stable. So what are you going to do for this patient? See, he's having a third degree heart block. And he had a recent MI and a percutaneous intervention was done. And now he's stable. So what was the risk of complete or third degree heart block? Yeah, you're right, doctor. We are going to do temporary transvenous spacing. And why are we going to do temporary transvenous spacing? Since the patient is stable, we could have gone for permanent pacing because it's a third degree heart block. So why are we doing a temporary transvenous spacing? Do you have any idea? Would you like to tell me? Okay, so we are doing this because we are suspecting that there's a reversible cause behind this. Yes, that he's recently had an MI, and the MI could be causing this heart block because it has damaged the cardiac tissue, the musculature, the electrical system, conduction system going on. So that is causing the third degree heart block. So we cannot just observe and repeat the ECG because complete heart block could go on and cause a cardiac arrest. And that's a very dangerous situation, and we want to avoid that at any cost. And yeah, we are doing transvenous, a temporary transvenous spacing for this one. And we are not doing transcutaneous spacing because it is used only in emergencies and the patient is currently stable. If it was unstable patient, we could have gone for transcutaneous spacing as well. And permanent pacemaker, we don't need to give because we're suspecting that this is a temporary situation going on. And after the patient recovers, the situation is going to get better. And IV atropine is not also going to, we are not going to use that because it is only used in like first degree or second degree heart blocks rather than the third degree or complete heart block. Now the next one, 49-year-old man, he's having acute anterior MI and he also has hypertension and type 2 diabetes. So these are the medications he's on and he has a very severe chest pain. So what medication are you going to give to him for his chest pain? This is quite an easy one. Yes, guys, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Definitely you're going to give him morphine because we know what is the mnemonic for the treatment of MI, MONA. So we're going to give him morphine. So nitrates would be contraindicated in this patient because he has taken sildenafil, and paracetamol is not used for analgesia in MI. It's going to be useless, and naproxen is also of not going to be of any use here. And beta blockers, once again, no need to give. We can give them later after the patient has stabilized. Mona is the thing that you need to do. So morphine comes here. IV morphine, 2.5 to 4 milligrams. Now the fifth one, he has several episodes of angina in the past, smoker, multiple comorbidities, What do you think is the strongest predictor of MI in the next 2 years? So guys, these type of questions, they are sort of epidemiological questions. So you need to remember what are the strongest predictors of MI and what is the strongest risk factor for stroke or strongest one for hypertension. So you need to remember these. So for this one, it is smoking, and smoking is the strongest uh, modifiable risk factor which a patient for MI can have. And previous angina is not an independent predictor, so it is not this one. And hypertension is a long-term risk factor, but it is not a acute one, like given this 2 year time frame. So just you just have to cram this question. It is a recall, so I put it here because it was an atypical one rather than related to management. It was something that you need to cram. So that's why I put it here. So smoking is the answer here. Also, please, guys, please check which is the strongest risk factor for stroke and which is the strongest risk factor for hypertension, because these sort of questions are asked in the exam. Okay, that's why I'm telling you. Now the next one, this patient has central chest pain. He's having T wave inversions and ST depressions. His vital are stable. So which investigation are you going to do? So there were two investigations that we need to do to rule out if the patient is having an MI, STMI, NSTMI, or unstable angina or whatever. So what was the second one? We just discussed it, guys. I'm sure this must be easy for you. Yeah, you're very, very right. We are going to check the troponin. If the troponin is elevated, we can say that this is an NSTMI. And if the troponins are normal, we are going to consider this an unstable angina and do risk assessment for this patient. Very well. Now the next one. So the patient has just been shifted from ICU and he had a pacemaker insertion. Now he's having chest pain, shortness of breath, and his vitals, we can think that his vitals are stable. And ECG is normal, chest auscultation is normal, but he's having chest pain. So what investigation are we going to do for this patient? Just make a guess, guys. It's okay. Okay, so this patient had a pacemaker inserted, and the pacemaker is usually done through the jugular vein. It could be given from that. It's basically a transvenous pacing that could have been done for this patient. So, what could be the reasons that the patient is having shortness of breath after this procedure was done to them? So, the various reasons could be it could be pneumothorax also. There could be pulmonary causes rather than cardiac causes as well. And we have already done an ECG. So we are going to do an X-ray first because we have to rule out. Could have been even a pneumothorax as well. Could be hemothorax, could be pulmonary embolism, could be anything. So we are going to do a chest X-ray first for this patient because ECG is already normal. If ECG was not given, we would have done an ECG first. But since the ECG is already done and normal, so we are going to do a chest X-ray. Yeah, chest X-ray. So the next one, see, CTPA we could have done if we were suspecting an angina. And troponin we could have done if there was an abnormality in the ECG even. And we could have done an NCCT if we were suspecting any structural problem, like with the lungs. But an echo we don't need to do. We would have done if there was we were thinking that a tamponade or something like that was going on. But with tamponade, you could expect the dextroid as well. So it is chest X-ray that we need to do in this one. So this patient, he's hypertensive, he's diabetic, and he's having numbness, nausea, sweating, dizziness, and irregular pulse. He's having atrial fibrillation. So why do you think he's having dizziness and numbness along? Because as well as atrial fibrillation going on is ECG. So which of these options do you think are the cause of his symptoms? Yeah, this is arrhythmia related. So it could have been MI related, but ECG is already done and it shows atrial fibrillation. Micturition syncope is quite common in elderly people, but it does not relate us to this atrial fibrillation that is given to us in the step. Vasovagal syncope you get if the patient is having any emotional stress going on, standing for a very long time, and orthostatic hypertension. It occurs when the patient gets up from a sitting or lying down position, and there should be a drop of at least 20 millimeters of mercury when you do a blood pressure monitoring. So now this one, it's an 18-year-old girl. She's having a sudden collapse, transient loss of consciousness. Her GCS is fine, and she does a lot of self-induced vomiting. Her BMI is normal. What do you think is causing the collapse in this patient? What investigation are you going to constitute for her? Yeah, we definitely need to do an ECG for this patient. And why is that? Because she's most likely suffering from an eating disorder, and that causes electrolyte disturbances in this patient. And if the patient is having a loss of consciousness or syncope or collapse, then we need to rule out any cardiac abnormalities, any arrhythmias. So ECG is what we are going to do for this patient. Rather than doing anything else. Serum potassium we can do later if we find any ECG abnormalities to check the extent of abnormality. And glucose we don't need to do at this time because she's fully conscious now. EEG we don't need to do because we're not suspecting any seizure. There's no abnormal activity given to us. And CT head we don't need to do unless there was a case of head trauma or something, which is not given to us here. We'll do serum potassium or any electrolyte disturbances later. But first, we need to rule out any cardiac conduction abnormalities going on or any arrhythmia going on. So ECG is the answer here. Now the next one, it's a 20-year-old male. He's having atrial fibrillation. He's feeling faint, but no chest pain, no shortness of breath, and he's stable. So what are you going to do for this person? So remember, guys, what do we do in atrial fibrillation? If the patient is stable, what do we do? If the patient is unstable, what do we do? Here, the patient is stable. Yes, yes, you're very, very correct. So we are going to give the patient beta blockers. So there are three scenarios in atrial fibrillation. Here the patient is stable, so we don't need to shock them out of it. Just remember, whenever the patient is unstable, we just shock them out of it. But here the patient is stable. Now in stable, you had two options, either rate control or rhythm control. So rate control, we were constituting if the rhythm control we were constituting if it was a young patient, if they were having atrial fibrillation for less than 6 months, and if the patient was symptomatic. Though the patient is uh, symptomatic here, but we are not given the time frame for which the atrial fibrillation is going on. So we'll just do the rate control, which is giving the beta blocker. So metoprolol is the thing we need to do here. Amiodarone we do in VT or VF, not here. Digoxin, once again, we no need to give. We give only if it is a chronic atrial fibrillation and heart failure. Vagal maneuver if it is stable PSVT. DC cardioversion if it was an unstable patient. So the only answer that we have is beta blocker that we can give to this patient. Now this one, it's a patient who was brought to the emergency department. They have palpitations and they have an ECG shown. So please check this ECG. I will ask two questions from you. Please tell me what do you think this ECG is, and then tell me what do you think the treatment should be. Yeah, definitely. Okay. And what do you think the treatment for this is? Yeah. Yep. Yep. So guys, first of all, we are checking that what is the rate of the CCG. So you can see there are two big boxes between each R wave. So divide this by 300, you're getting a heart rate of 150 beats per minute. So this is definitely a tachycardia. Now you're going to look at the QRS complexes. So here you can see that the QRS complexes are quite narrow. You can even calculate, if you can see the small boxes, you can multiply with 0.04 millisecond. You'll get the length of a QRS complex. So here you can see this is a narrow complex tachycardia, and it is regular, and the patient is having palpitations, and you can see that this is definitely PSVT. So PSVT, since the patient is stable, we can either give vagal maneuver. Has no option for modified Valsalva. We are not gonna do that because there's no option here. And the only other option that's left with us is IV adenosine. It's the drug of choice for paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia. I guess this is the last question for today. So please tell me, guys, it's an 18-month-old child and face down in the swimming pool. The mother has started CPR. The child was intubated with an uncuffed ET tube. Capnography was normal earlier, but now they're having a flat line waveform. What do you think is the cause of this flat line waveform? Yeah, the patient is in cardiac arrest now. So that's why we are getting a flatline waveform. So why is this question like this? Because if the ET tube was in esophagus, you would not have gotten any waveform on capnography initially. Like it was normal during the earlier transport. So that means the patient was not in cardiac arrest at that time. And definitely the tube was not in esophagus. So it could not be that. And if the ET tube was in the right main bronchus, you would have gotten an abnormal capnography waveform earlier only, rather than getting a normal waveform earlier during the transport. So it is also not this. And if the patient was having a bronchospasm, once again, you get a particular sort of waveform in capnography rather than getting a normal one. Now the patient is in cardiac arrest, and that's why the waveform is flat. And if the patient was having pulmonary embolism, once again, it would have an abnormal waveform rather than getting a normal one during the earlier transport. So definitely the answer to this is cardiac arrest. So guys, this is it for today. And if you have any questions, please ask. And if you enjoyed today's session, and if you want to continue having these sort of sessions, then please join us with the MedPrep online, and we'll be sure and quite happy to lead you through your AMC MCK examination preparation and help you sort out any queries that you have. So please, guys, come ahead and ask me any questions that you have. I hope this session was understandable to you and I was able to show you some of the ECGs and tell you how to recognize some of the common arrhythmias that we get. And I hope this was helpful to you. And please join our next session that we could hold soon. And yeah, this is all for today. Okay, guys. Thank you so much. Have a good day.